So this is the second day of our symposium. We have Alistair Hudson with us, who will talk about very interesting topics. And the title of his talk is How Can Public Cultural Institutions Model New Viable Economic and Social Systems? And I just would like to introduce him. He has been a scientific artistic chairman of the ZKM in Karlsruhe since April 2023, succeeding Peter Weibel, whom I think we all know, who had headed this institution since 1999. Alistair Hudson is a curator and museum director, and he directed two museums in Manchester, and the Manchester Art Gallery and the Whitworth, the Art Museum of the University of Manchester, where he also held the position of Professor of Useful Art. And we wanted to invite him because also because of this of a very interesting series of 3 small publications that ZKM in Karlsruhe issued, related to different institutional models, different thinking about art institutions. And I also remember that you have been working as a deputy director for Grisadale Arts, which is like an arts center in a rural setting that I was also, following the program for a while. So it's also for us, I guess, it's interesting your path from the smaller ones into now this big organism in Germany. I think we can start, and thank you for coming to us. And you are on holiday, so we really appreciate it. Thank you.
No, thank you, and it's a pleasure to join you all. I'm sorry I can't be there, but I speak to you from somewhere in deepest England to kind of engage in the conversation you're starting here. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess, institutional transformation, and I suppose one of my preoccupations was always how do we adapt these old artistic infrastructures into a new technological age. And so in some ways, because I have a kind of history of social practice predominantly, it was maybe a surprise to some that I would take on an institution like ZKM, but hopefully I can kind of walk you through a bit of a history which might then exemplify some of the ideas and some of the ambitions that we're trying to develop. And also apologies to Stephen and Tamarind in advance. You've probably seen a lot of this weave but I will try and weave a different story again this time. So I will share my screen if I can find it. 1 second.
Excuse me, we have a short announcement related to the translations that we are offering. We forgot to say it. Lisa, do you want to say it?
Yeah, sorry, I was a bit late. So I just wanted to say hello also. Sorry for interrupting. Just to say we have possibilities for translation today into plain language from English to German and easy or plain German. We have Anne and Franka there, so you can just grab one of the headphones. Yeah, just to let you know. Mm-hmm. I don't think we have the option for it. Yeah, but this works really well. I've done it yesterday. Yeah, and just that you all know, because there are some new faces today. The toilet is outside. If you need any help, just ask us. There are members of our team today. You can just, easily ask everyone. Okay, welcome.
Sorry.
Okay, thanks. So this is a picture of the main entrance foyer of ZKM, for those that don't know it. But I principally wanted to talk about this idea of participation, which I think is at the foreground of many artistic concerns at the moment, and particularly participation in not just culture and art institutions, but participation in life in general, and how really our sort of the advancement of our technological society has both inhibited that and enabled that at the same time. And I can, in a way, wind back and use a starting point which is close to me, which is my home city of Manchester in the north of England. And Manchester was the basically the first industrial city in the world, and around about the beginning of the 19th century, it looked something like this, which was a sea of chimneys and black smoke encroaching upon the landscape of Britain. And it was also the place in which Marx and Engels did their anthropological studies in order to write their Communist Manifesto. And this is the sort of setting in which I have been for a long time looking at the development of artistic institutions, because of course this was the moment that really the art museum as we know it emerged. Prior to this, it was principally private collectors, royalty, very very kind of private wealth that created collections. But it was really in the 19th century that this idea of the kind of public institution emerged. And one of the voices that I have always been very fascinated by is kind of a complex character, but a very rich thinker, was John Ruskin, who at the time of the Industrial Revolution was the critique and the voice against it and its detriments. And though he was an artist, he was also an art historian and a polymath who really wanted to have a different kind of imaginary for the world than the one that was developing around him. And it's interesting that the city of Manchester at this moment created one of the largest exhibitions ever known in the history of the world. So the Great Art Treasures exhibition of 1853 to 1857 was basically a copy of the 1851 exhibition in London, where this temporary palace was erected, and in this over 37,000 works of art were presented in this temporary structure just outside the main city centre. And of course the exhibition, the idea of the exhibition, was really something that was complicit in imperial and capital development of the economy and society. And these treasures were a way of showing your wealth of knowledge, wealth and power, and fiscal wealth at the same time. And at the time of this exhibition, the city and the organisers invited John Ruskin to come and speak at the Royal Manchester Institution, which is essentially one version of something called the Mechanics Institutes, which arose at the beginning of the 19th century, from about 1800 onwards, in the English-speaking world, as a place where you would learn science and arts together, that you would bring the working classes into these institutions in order to give them education in the technology that was developing around them, but also a sense of humanity that was embedded in the arts. And through this fusion, you would create basically a happy society, but also one that was productive and driving the innovation that was required for the technological development of the age. And these institutions, which held libraries and workshops and art collections, were really the things that became museums. They later on became the capitalist attention economy model that we know now. But what was interesting to me, that was prior to this moment of the Great Exhibition, this was an idea of art and science in use in daily life. Now, it was interesting that they, at the time of this exhibition, they invited John Ruskin to give a lecture, an art history lecture, at the institution, to go alongside and to sort of open in a grand way the Great Exhibition. But what John Ruskin did, in fact, was to give a 6-hour lecture split over 2 days on the political economy of art, and actually on political economy itself, in a way as a riposte to Adam's model of economy, and to essentially say that you are doing it all wrong. You capitalists who are building these factories and industries and using art basically as art washing for your technocratic development is crushing the people. And what we need is a form of art which embeds art and art thinking in everyday life. To think not as art as something that is additional to and on top of as a luxury, but to embed artistic thinking in everything we do, from the environment to industry to economics to how we run our healthcare system. This became a very influential book, but I won't go into that now. But certainly it set the tone for me about what our institutions should be doing and how we should think about art, rather than it being something which is really modeled by this kind of hyper-capitalism that has evolved since this moment and formed the art world as we know it today. It so happened that I later in life, a few years ago, I became the director of the Manchester Art Gallery, which was formerly the Royal Manchester Institution, and here tried to, in a way, rediscover the DNA of this institution and how it used to operate before advanced capitalism got its hands on an exhibition program, which was the usual chain of blockbusters and exhibitions of Marina Abramovich and Gerhard Richter and everybody else that sells tickets these days. So I'd worked for a long time with Tanya Bagheera on this project called Arte Útil, which is the idea of art as a tool, or useful art in its more crude sense. And the idea was to revisit and repurpose the building or sections of the building in ways that would bring it back to its role as an educational institution for all, that would have a wish to have some kind of real social impact. And this is very important and comes into play later on when we're talking about media art, which is forms of art which are not representational, not representing or making a picture of an idea, but actually operating. They are operational in the world beyond the walls of the museum. So a project like School of Integration transformed the museum into education space, where basically the idea was, instead of basically migrant populations being taught how to be English or how to be British, which is the usual way, it was many different cultures, 180 cultures, teaching other cultures about their culture. So it was this kind of omnidirectional learning engine that became, in a way, a metaphor for how we wanted to run the institution. And this involved also turning the standard exhibition spaces of the museum, which originally had educational and social development functions, into ones that would be in play in the world. So one gallery here that you see, we turned into a child development center, so that rather than necessarily mothers and bringing their young babies into a clinic to do the development work with doctors and clinical professionals, they would do this work with the doctors and clinicians in the museum itself, and use the art collection as a tool in which to study the development of children and child-parent bond. And it was actually proven by the doctoral student we had working with us on this project that the development of children rapidly increased in this environment compared to the slightly sort of mundane environment of the medical center down the road. And yeah, here you see some sort of works made by both Edwin Landseer on the left and by 3-year-old children on the right. And the other institution that I was involved in as director was the Whitworth Art Gallery, which was slightly south of the city centre, but equally had its foundations in this idea of the institute. And whilst this museum or institute had been redeveloped in the sort of spectacular architectural form that is now very common with our museum culture, particularly around the turn of the century, again we could look back at this idea of an institute which included both an art gallery and park that was designed specifically to improve the lives of the people who were workers and inhabiting in the city. And what was interesting to me was that it was situated not in the city centre, but out in the periphery, where there were in fact a lot of migrant communities and specifically Afro-Caribbean communities that came into this area in the 1980s, and this is also in the heat of the kind of the Thatcher moment, when our sort of new economy was emerging and pushing people who did not fit with the kind of Thatcherite, Reaganite version of society into the margins. And this resulted in this neighborhood around the gallery erupting into riots in the 1980s, rather famously in the UK, with kind of really drastic scenes of devastation. But what I became aware of was that in the middle of this conflict, there was a nightclub called the Reno. And we'd been working with a local group who were looking at the history of this nightclub called the Reno, which is basically where the Afro-Caribbean communities had a nightclub where it was effectively their cultural institution, but this is also where the community organized and self-organized in the middle of this conflict. And we began a project with them, which had previously been just an oral history project working in the margins of the museum. And what I wanted to do was to bring it center stage and to make it in a way in the place where we would previously have done, the large-scale exhibitions. So this project also involved, working with the university, an archaeological dig of the site where the nightclub was, because this area was, after the riots, all these areas were cleared by the city council for the development of new housing. But this area was left empty, and we undertook this archaeological dig and then presented the findings in the museum itself. So kind of beer glasses and Coke cans, crisps, and, bags of drugs, old records, all the paraphernalia that used really, that became a springboard for telling this story that had been lost. But also importantly, that this community that was around us could use the institution, the museum that had never been in previously or never been invited to or felt welcome in previously, to make it their place, including turning it into a nightclub on regular occasions. And so this sort of breaking of the boundaries and the rules of an institution of what it showed, even in a contemporary sense, was part of this kind of reverse engineering of the public museum. And I was thinking a lot, working with the social practitioner and media artist Suzanne Lacey round about this time, where she had a major survey exhibition at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And there her work was presented as very much the back catalogue of images and archive and documentation and video of a 50-year career. But I thought, well, could we transform this exhibition into one that then actually worked for the city? Given an artist who is so embedded in the history of social practice and social movements, how could we make this work come alive rather than it just being a look back at what had happened? So the idea was really to make an announcement that we would work with Suzanne Lacey to use her archive as a manual for how we might then enable social change in the city. So first off, we visited her Oakland project's work through the 1980s, in basically amongst the kind of communities of at Oakland on the edge of San Francisco, where there was conflict between Black youth and police. And essentially, television was used as the medium then of these kids making their own TV programs to advocate for a better future and a better conditions in which to live. Now, of course, these works were presented in the museum as a history, as a way to learn, and for our neighborhoods and communities around us to learn from this particular historical moment, but then also to use this space as a way to develop new education and new kind of life pathways for youth groups in the city, particularly where there was a large amount of gang violence and knife crime and drugs and drug culture, etc. And what this allowed for us was to invite this community worker into the museum with Suzanne, who's there on the right, to develop projects which would use the institution as a base, as a place to get young people out of their complex conditions and into a pathway into education that would take them out of this kind of world of violence. And rather than using TV, we kind of basically used online media and social media to develop a program with these young people. And what I was interested in is how we would kind of repurpose and reuse the infrastructures of the museum in order for us to do this. And one thing that we did in order to basically practically finance this project of youth work in the city was to take this iconic image from our collection, which is William Blake's Ancient of Days, which is actually about power and control in the universe, but I won't go into that now. And to make an NFT, this is at the moment of the NFT bubble, before it burst, to create an NFT from this work in our collection that would then be sold and raise the finances to run a youth program. And this, in the end, it worked. It raised about $60,000, which could then be used to kind of create this ongoing program within the museum. And then the other kind of project we did with Suzanne at Manchester Art Gallery was to look at her history of working with women and basically creating conditions in which women would have a greater say and empowerment within the situations, and to do a project which really addressed one of the key issues in the city, which was that women over 50 and at the intersection of basically race and class had the worst life prospects of any part of our section of our society in the country. And so this project was really something that happened during COVID, which was basically forming a group who would meet every week with Suzanne through the museum and our mediators to really start to ask questions into this problem that older women in the city were facing, and to develop a strategy through the museum, which we called Uncertain Futures, which was about addressing kind of the intersectional conditions that created the impoverishment in their lives, poor health, poor job prospects, and an alienation from the city. And so then we kind of repurposed a section of the museum into basically a research center. It was, again, using works from the collection, such as this painting by Ford Maddox Brown called Work, alongside a historical work there called Cleaning Conditions, made by Suzanne Lacey in the 1990s. And in this research center, conduct closed-door interviews with hundreds of women from around the city to look at their life conditions and their prospects, and to think about what else could be done. And essentially, the project, which lasted, is still ongoing today, was about recording this data with university sociologists and researchers, basically to make the case to take to the city, to change policy, and also to take this on a national level to Westminster, to the government in London, to demand the changes that were required for political change and for the living conditions of this older section of society. And interestingly for me, I sort of had a sort of flashback moment that when I realized that the original institutes like this were the places where, when the working classes came together, were actually the places where unions were created. So in a way, this is a kind of a rebirth of the institution as a campaigning social institution, and not just one that was about learning about the greats of art history. And so I kind of summarize this kind of methodology, because there are many projects that I could talk about in this vein. But essentially, this is the schematic that I kind of often use, which is about art beyond art, moving away from an autonomous artistic system, thinking less about spectators and the spectator economy into a usership of the museum, and allowing people to kind of use these spaces, authors to initiators, representation to operation I talked about, and thinking about constituencies rather than audience, which is the language of the market, and moving beyond collections in terms of thinking about what is it about a collection that is important for a museum. And essentially it is about the relationship between things, but also the relationship between people. And something that I will, in a way, took very much more into the next chapter, I'll talk about for the second half, which is about thinking about how a big institution like ZKM can move away from this exhibitionary era of the Great Exhibition into a world we might describe as modesty. If you think about exhibition, the opposite being modesty, which is about working in a humble continuum rather than necessarily these kind of great moments of spectacle. And also something I was aware of going into something like ZKM, which had been run by a singular leader for a very long time, that this cult of leadership was very much a product of the last 100 years or so, and that particularly as you kind of look at the world around us, the last thing we know is that it needs at the moment is necessarily more leaders and the way that they operate. And for me to think more about this word of fellowship, about how we operate as an institution in fellowship with those around us. So yeah, ZKM, this is the building from the air, so you kind of see the scale of it. Which was it's a repurposed ammunitions factory from the First and Second World Wars. If you like, a building of destruction, repurposed as a building of creativity in the late 80s and early 90s. And something that appealed to me about this project was that it was very much in the spirit of those institutions that were formed in the early 1800s that I talked about just before. And the ZKM itself, when its founding idea in 88, 89, was this idea of the electronic Bauhaus. And this idea of the Bauhaus actually then also has, for me personally, has its DNA roots in the arts and crafts movement, and in the and in this institutional, technological institutional history in the UK, but actually also in Germany. In that these kind of technological institutions were also being driven from the 19th century onwards here in Germany. So really, the idea was always that ZKM was not a museum, deliberately not a museum, a static institution, a preservation institution, but one that was forward-looking, and one that was basically driven by research and development, by production and presentation, and by education as well. So this kind of holy trinity of how you develop culture, how you develop society and technology, really underpinning the institution. And this is very much kind of manifested in how the building was always imagined as this sort of factory of creative production, but one that includes, for example, the Hochschule für Gestaltung, which is taking young people, training them in an artistic, technological framework, and then this feeding through into the mindset and development and growth and research of the institution. Now, at the moment that I took over, one of the big challenges was that for many years, the ZKM had been, in a way, first the electronic Bauhaus, then the digital Bauhaus. It was very much the place you go to for kind of developing the new art of our times, the new technologies. But very rapidly, this idea of digital art, of media art, was no longer something that was the sole province of institutions like ZKM or Ars Electronica, but it was very much a kind of released into the world and merged with the world and other institutions at the same time. And also as this moment of kind of redistribution of media art sensibility, at the same time we have this kind of huge rapid development of technology that's happening right in front of us, where not only can we not no longer just have sole dominion over the technologies in front of us, we don't even know what is to come in 3 years' time, let alone 30 years' time. So this was the challenge of how to really adapt the institution very much as an ongoing process of communal technological development where we learn together. So it's no longer I'm going to make an exhibition about what I know about technology and my thesis on what technology is or what culture is, but to say we don't know, so let us develop this together. And we've also moved from this moment of kind of what you might call the digital world, here illustrated by the undersea cables that connect the internet, which interestingly still mirrors the old imperial trade routes, into something more like this, which is use of open source mapping data in what used to be known as the global south, but essentially is the emerging world now that we have of what you might call what I consider to be the post-digital age, the world beyond the digital of ones and zeros, but this kind of hybridization of different cultures, different polarities, different positions, different technologies, and even ecological and biological technologies, really giving a different economy that is shaping the world in ways we do not yet know. So the idea was really to develop a program which I put under the rubric of fellow travelers, this kind of old phrase which was about people basically going on a journey together along the road, learning from one another as they go, but also had resonance in that it was the term given by the CIA to communist sympathizers in the Cold War. And actually, my view always was that whilst I'm not a communist, but I certainly have kind of a socialist mindset, or certainly an understanding that the way that our system is currently working is not working for the planet. And in these social ideals, there might be something that could basically shape the world in a different way. So this became, in a way, an exhibition platform, but really a work in progress that would show artists who were really engaging with trying to adapt and shape the world on their own terms in their own localities. So this is Zhang Gugu, who is building extraordinary gardens in China based on the Age of Empires computer game from 1997, which used to be a player, but now constructing these amazing landscapes, but specifically for the nurturing of plants, rather than for people. And through this, we basically presented his work, but are developing a garden project for this glass building at the front of the ZKM, which will be a kind of post-digital techno outpost of his Lao garden in a winter garden form in the center of Germany. Other examples, for example, that we showed, probably this one very well known, which is the Congolese plantation workers Art League, who were creating or still creating NFTs based on sculptures from their communities that were basically taken away from them as part of that plantation world that that shaped our world economy, but shaped theirs in a very disastrous way. And this project is now refunding the kind of re-establishment of their own sustainable agriculture. So that, for example, if the ZKM shows and acquires these works, we become implicated in this wider economic system of change. And at the center of our kind of non-exhibition was this idea of the museum, a space which would be used by different communities, different players, agents within the city, through our educational institutions, that would be used as a space in which we could plot and plan a different kind of future and ask the questions of what is it that we need, and what is it that we need to do as an institution, but also as a society. And this really started to feed forward into new projects. So the idea was this fellow travelers platform showed works, but then they evolved into other ways of working or new projects that would have an impact. And one of those is underway this year, which is really about thinking about the not leaving Mars to the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses of the world, and thinking about how we might make a society from scratch on Mars as an imaginary to think about how we might make a resilient society here on Earth first, in order to then have the imaginary for what we might have in the future. And this is basically a series of workshops that takes place at ZKM about how, about recycling water, about economic planning, about decision making, that are then developed as a citizen science project throughout the summer, but then that then culminates in a biosphere in the center of the city, in which the participants will live and breathe and engage with the public in the center of Karlsruhe, outside the Rat House, next to this King Karl's tomb, the pyramid, in a center square. So we'll create in a way this new biosphere imaginary in order to shape the next future of Mars, ideally, but also for our own city, of our own world that we are living in. And where this has led me in these thinking processes, to think about how the technology that we have around us could be, again, like our institutions, reimagined and reharnessed in different ways, in new ways that actually serves wider society, rather than sort of the form of techno-capitalism that is destroying our world at the moment. And again, it's sort of in the history of our short living institution, I found examples in our collection of this, for example, which is it's an installation not by an artist but by the cybernetics guru Gordon Pask, called Colloquy of Mobiles, which is to demonstrate his conversation theory. And was originally exhibited as part of the exhibition Cybernetic Serendipity at the ICA in London in 1967. And this really opened the door to me about this kind of re-understanding of the history of cybernetics, which really actually came from ecology, and it actually came from a way of ecological thinking about how could we study and learn from the connectivity in the world in the most complex ways, and then to use our technological capabilities to model the world and understand the world and run the world in ways which was in a more balanced form, similar to our natural environment. And another work in our collection, which sort of opened my mind a little bit to this, was this work by Enrique Rivera, which looks at the history of a project called CyberSyn, which occurred in Chile in the 1970s. Some of you may know of this, but the story really is one a spectacular story where cybernetics was applied in Chile under the socialist president Allende, who invited the British cybernetician Stafford Beer to come and run or develop a computational system, a cybernetic system that would basically connect all the economy of the country, agriculture, factory production, healthcare, education, and for it to be monitored by this rather spectacular Star Trek-like control room, which was in a way not Big Brother, but in fact the opposite. The idea was it was how do you make an actually real lifetime participatory democracy where everybody has a say in how the country is operating with this kind of super connectivity. Although actually the reality was that this was using telex machines and 35mm slides in order to send and receive the data. But nonetheless, it opened a door and it opened a window to the possibility that you might have something which would create an alternative system to the dominant capitalism that was encroaching on the world, particularly in the 1970s. You think of the Reagan-Thatcher era of hypercapitalism moving us into where we are now. But this was a crucial moment, obviously, when, in a way, the powers that be did not want this to happen. They did not want, certainly, a kind of computer-powered socialism, just as our kind of computer age was beginning, and actually resulted in the CIA instigating a coup, which removed Allende, and in fact, he was killed in the uprising. And subsequently, CyberSyn dissolved, and it never actually happened. But nonetheless, Stafford Beer and the team that worked on the project then started to take it around different places in South America, to Uruguay, to Lima, to Cuba, to test it out in different situations. And what was really fascinating was that in Lima, in Peru, there was Centro, which was the Center for People's Participation, Populare, in which they were able to kind of start to continue the development of these models of alternative economic development. Again, the CIA, as they always did, instigated a coup, and this was overthrown, and it never happened. But nonetheless, the research and the work that they did, which also interestingly combined indigenous knowledge systems. This wasn't just about, the Stafford Beer moment is slightly fetishized as this basically, the white savior coming from Europe to solve all the problems. It actually comes much more deeply from a particular culture and a particular way of life in South America that is about, in a way, the social contract. And this is something that then cybernetics was able to empower. And around about this time, there was again in 1973, MIT produced the Limits to Growth report, which basically says we're all heading to catastrophe. But what is not so well known was at the same time, Centro produced another model which was called the Latin American world model. And this was to say, no, all your calculations at MIT were done using basically kind of Eurocentric Western data about, where all the seat of power is in the world right now. But if you model it on in a way that includes the global South and a complete ecological system of the planet, it is still possible to run our ecology, to run our economy, to run our industry, to run our healthcare systems in a way that is balanced and works for pretty much 99% of the population. But of course, this was never championed. It never succeeded in getting above the surface into mainstream conversation in the world. But interestingly, just 1 month ago, the Global Justice Report was published again with a review of this idea that you can that 99% of the world's population can live comfortably was released in this report, which is well worth a look at. So in a way, this gave me a little bit of hope that all is not lost, and that there are ways in which we can operate the world. And I'll just finish quickly with in a way somewhat of a key that unlocked this for me more recently, which is when we showed earlier this year this machine, which is the Connection Machine 2, CM2, from 1986, which was the first commercial machine made for artificial intelligence. So as we're thinking about this, new age of AI that we're embarking on, let us also revisit our old institution cathedrals of AI. And this machine, interestingly, was created by a German artist here, Kamiko Thiel. She was the lead designer, but there was a whole design team at MIT in Boston around 1986, who led the design of this machine that has an interesting cultural history. You can maybe see the references to HAL in 2001. But also influenced computers in its own way. It was the machine that Steve Jobs saw and said, "I want all my computers to look like this." And it was also the moment when basically university research goes into the world of the startup and the sideline company that emerge to develop technologies out of universities. But the original intention of this machine was to create the encyclopedic brain for everybody. This was the original idea. This is the design team here, and interestingly, on the left is Bruce DeCarl, who is one of the lead engineers on this project, who created Amazon Web Services and sold it off to Jeff Bezos, amongst many other things. And but he actually was the advocate of the complete open source system, in a way which is our form of computational socialism. And the idea, their idea was to make machines that would basically allow knowledge for everybody, and through this knowledge for everybody, we could have the power and the capabilities to run the world in a way that works for everybody. And this is, in a way, something that still holds true. So my thinking now is, given the connections, the capabilities of ZKM, could we think about, revisiting these original best intentions of cybernetics, the best intentions of AI, using the capabilities that we now have, which is not telex machines and slideshows from the 1970s, but the supercomputers like this one that we have access to in Stuttgart. This is the HLRS Supercomputing Center. And to really harness the power of these machines to model different ways of operating society, of different ways of thinking about our economy, different ways in which we might all participate and join in the culture that we are creating, and to model a culture that works for everybody. So at the moment, we're basically trying to get our hands on a set of machines like this, which are NVIDIA machines that allow us basically to have a kind of sovereign off-grid AI model at ZKM, which would then have free public access, that would be, in a way, the free public library of information that would allow us to imagine, in the same ways that the 19th century institutions imagined a unionization, it imagined a kind of a well-being of society, or in the ways that the CM2 imagined knowledge for all, or the way that cybernetics imagined a super connected system. Could we start to develop these models as cultural institutions that would really shape a different kind of future away from the disaster zone that we're heading into now? So I'll finish with this slide, which is a rather nice picture of ZKM every year for the GPN Gulasch Programmiernacht, where 3,000 nerds descend upon ZKM and go crazy on their own terms about how we might put the technology in the hands of the people. So that is the end of my presentation, and yeah, happy to chat and discuss.
Thank you for this very inspiring talk. And now we have time for comments, questions. Tamarind.
Thank you, Alistair. It was wonderful to hear what you're working on and some of the details that I didn't know about. And are you actually going to have people be able to come use these at the ZKM? Like, how close is this final project that you just presented?
Yeah, that's it. So that's the idea. Is that we would, if we find the money, which is quite a lot, it's about 4 million. But in the grand scheme of things, if you think about what museums take to build, maybe not so much. But the idea would be to have basically a set of machines, then our own large language models, and that would essentially be set up actually in that fellow traveller space as a whole one section of that, as basically a research centre for artists, for publics, for people to come and use these machines and be trained on them, and basically also to have the kind of the knowledge development as a kind of everyday AI school at ZKM. But again, importantly, we can do this because we have the know-how and the knowledge and the capabilities. But the idea would also be to network it. And obviously, very much at the moment, the big discussion is about how you create a version of AI which is not the US model, which is not the Chinese model, but one which is, has this European sensibility. And so I was actually talking to Bruce DeCarl, the guy from the CM2, came up. We did a conference about that. He came over and he was really excited about basically creating a new completely open source AI model based in Europe using basically European legislation. He says there's no way this will ever happen in the US anymore. The US will be run by 3, maybe 1 company in the next 10 years. And he said there's no way you will have the public access to do that. But in Europe, even he says we have the chance to do this here now, to the extent that he's bought a property in Amsterdam. He's kind of moving here for half the year, and there is a real push now to develop these models where you actually have a kind of cultural creativity embedded in the population. So this would be, yes, a way to do that. And obviously, like any art institution model, it's not that this would be the answer to everything, but at least you could work with artists to develop new works, new ways of working with these things that then can be done in tandem with an education program, with a community outreach program, but then would also then be networked with other models. And for example, an area of interest of mine is like, how do we change the education system? The way people are learning has completely changed, will completely change. So we need to start thinking about how we do that in schools from age 4 onwards, about how we do that, because we're no longer training our brains or adapting our brains the right way. So, these are kind of big questions, but I think ones we can at least make an inroad to, through ZKM, but it would also be done in partnership with other institutions as well, because you do, as I kind of hopefully indicated, that's the kind of fellowship model that you need, rather than creating these castles of knowledge and power.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Right, but I have to find the money.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation and kind of like for taking us through the arc of your trajectory from your directorship of the Manchester galleries to now being at ZKM for the last few years. I'm curious, and it's a broad, I guess a more broad question, but it's a genuine kind of like interest in hearing you speak a little bit about how, I guess, to connect to some of the things that we were talking about yesterday in this symposium, because it's a very different context. So thinking about British class politics and, kind of everything that you're doing in Manchester to going to Karlsruhe. And I was just wondering, like, to what extent did you feel that you had to adapt your, I guess in a way, your ethos, kind of like your ethos of working, what was important to you, what kind of objectives did you want to do? You worked a lot with communities in Manchester, with all of those wonderful programs. You tried to create space within the institution to shift the soft architectures of the space. And it seems like a slightly different thing that you are doing with ZKM, which is like kind of more media heavy, obviously, given the nature of the institution with new media. I appreciate that you're also still doing a lot of these kind of trying to get people to take over the space and, kind of disrupt the institution a little from within. But because of the very, very different contexts of the UK, especially of Manchester, and and kind of like Karlsruhe, I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about what changes you felt you had to make in terms of your own approach to directorship, or what you call now fellowship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, I mean, of course, they're different contexts totally, and you have to adapt to them, and I have had to adapt. I mean, the contrasts are significant. Manchester's a city of, it's a conurbation of 5 million people. Karlsruhe is 300,000. Manchester has really severe social problems. Karlsruhe doesn't really have any. It's a comfortable, well-off city in Baden-Württemberg, and it's a Beamtenstadt. It has the High Court there. It's a very different situation. But so it's a question of sort of getting to know and feeling your way around it. But I think in a way, I always think that people are people wherever you go. The people's brains still work in the same way. The communities are different, but still there are communities there that have needs and wants and issues, and we have been working with those. But I think it's really a question of kind of mixing these ideas together a little bit, and I think for me that's how cultural change works. If you kind of look at the influence of how the vinyl record changed world culture, it was really through the these kind of cultural exchanges and dissonances and things that are initially quite different, then find a way to come into some kind of equilibrium. And I've had to think about it in a different way, that there aren't these kind of necessarily scales of social issues that can be addressed in the way that they could be in Manchester, but nonetheless, in a way, with the institution, the scale of Zukünften and its international reach, in a way, the community changes to being an internationally networked one. So in a way, this is why I've started to think about, well, how can we think about, in a way that a museum used to, I mean, it sounds stupidly grandiose in a way, but it is the way I'm thinking, that could we think about, in a way, the community of a museum that you're doing your outreach or your mediation or your processing with? Could that then be like the international community, the global community of the planet, and we could use their chems, in a way, power as a technological institution to talk to power, to talk to Berlin, to talk to the European Parliament, to talk to economists. In a way, why not? For me, there are very few places where these discourses can evolve in public. Mm-hmm. And so I think what Zukünften offers is a scale to have those kinds of developmental conversations and experiments that could then be taken and introduced as part of the discussion somewhere else. Yeah. But in a way, it's still this idea, in the same way that years ago, Annette mentioned Grisdale, where we'd work, with a village community on an artist project. You then might apply those same thought processes or methodologies, but on a much larger scale, about how do we change the education system in a country. In a way, it's not that different. Mm-hmm. And obviously the scale is different and the ambition is different, but I sort of think about it in those ways.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I was kind of also asking maybe a question about situatedness, so context and contextualization of your work and your vision and your ethos, but also Karlsruhe, as far as I know, first of all, there are a lot of migrant communities in Karlsruhe. So in terms of how are you also working with these migrant communities and second generation migrants as well in Karlsruhe? And then maybe more importantly, because you're thinking about using this as a kind of springboard for change or a springboard for, you know, larger, as you said, grandiose visions of change, making change in terms of transformational justice. So Karlsruhe, as far as I know, is the location of the state archives, or what you call the Bundesarchiv of Germany. So the federal archives of Germany are located in Karlsruhe. And these archives, depending on who's doing the work of excavation, are pretty violent, you know, in terms of what they contain, what they hold, what they store, the gaps in the archives, what stories are being told there, how they're being curated, who has access to the archives, etc. So I think that there is still a lot of work to be done in Karlsruhe, as innocuous as it might seem. And yeah, I guess, you know, kind of, I was asking a question about like how your situatedness of being in Karlsruhe is, or how you see this as, you know, also kind of maybe an opportunity, seeing as you're directing the space now in fellowship with others, to really kind of, you know, shake things up a little, I guess. I mean, you don't have to answer it now, but just
because the way I always thought about it, and we had a long discussion with other institutions over the years around this move from the idea of audience to constituencies. And this idea of constituencies is quite different from the idea of community. So there was a culture in museums where basically for a while, where particularly with the advent of social practice, where you did community outreach projects to the community, or you sort of invited them in and engaged with, but usually it was people who were sort of slightly, you know, they were like the target communities who did need the help. But in a way of shifting to thinking more about constituencies, you have these different networks and groups that are multi-layered and overlap. And you have to kind of work in that sense. And I think Karlsruhe is a very good example. So we do, for example, so through the museum, we have set up a network of networks in the city, which is basically the initiatives, the collectives, the community working, for example, the group that works with the Turkish community, and working with them through Zukünften, but in a way that isn't like, hey, come to the museum and we'll solve all your problems. It's more like, how can we join in the city dynamics of what is needed, what is being shaped, but to also do that in the same way with, for example, you know, we have a huge legal community in the city, which I think also you refer to, and the archives, and they are really open and willing to open into discussion with us as well, as is, you know, the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, as is, you know, the scientific community, the research community. And what's very interesting is that we have, based in the city, Forum Recht, which is you know, sort of like, you know, the sort of the legal organization within the city, who are also thinking in quite creative ways about how you can create social transformation. So for me, it's about it's like a combination of these different constituent groups that make up the city, that make up the psychology of the city, and working with them in a way that is kind of multi-directional, but then also internationally connected as well, because that's the thing, or rather what I call maybe interlocally connected. So it might be, for example, that what we're talking about, for example, is through the kind of network capabilities that, you know, a particular community organization in Karlsruhe can work now through an artist research, you know, with a community organization in Mexico City about basically finding technological tools they can use in their own neighborhood to kind of reach the kind of change situations they're seeking. So it's a way of working that you have to develop, which is sort of working on the micro and the macro at the same time, and thinking about that as the ecology. Does that make sense in terms of your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
also have a question. I wanted to ask you. During this symposium, we also talk a lot about different types of constraints and difficulties related to running art institutions or thinking differently about them. And I wanted to ask you, because your concept is really very unique, and especially in German context, I think the way you think about the museum is very unique. And I wanted to ask you, did you, we have all these examples of directors trying to change institutions, even, in Cologne with Rautenstrauch-Jost Museum, and then, a big conflict inside of the institution. Like, did you, how is it for you to implement these changes in this specific German context? Like, did you also have had to change the way the institution works, the internal processes? I want to talk about this side of the work. Yes.
Oh, sorry. The sound was a bit echoey. Could you just say briefly? I think I understood the question, but you just say it again briefly.
I just wanted to ask you about the difficulties in the process of implementing this kind of a change within such a large structure like a museum, and especially in Germany, that is quite, I think, conservative in that respect. And I have a feeling that very often this kind of a more progressive concepts are not really understood here. So how was it for you? And did you also have to adopt the structure of the institution, the working processes, in order to work differently with constituencies? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, of course. No, I mean it is a different culture in Germany, and the cultural institutions here, they are quite conservative. I don't mean that necessarily negatively, but they are embedded in a tradition and a way of thinking about art and culture, which is not necessarily traditionally so open to these other ways of working, and there's kind of economic and political reasons why that is. UK institutions always had to kind of fight for their money and fight for their mode of existence in ways that German ones never did until this point. But what's quite interesting is now, with funding cuts, with the changing German economy, suddenly cultural institutions are under fire in ways they weren't before. Or the threat of funding is there that wasn't before. So there is a need to adapt and change. And then of course you have traditions, and it's the same. Every institution I've been to, when you arrive, it's always, but we've done it this way forever. We've always done it this way. And so you basically need to. It's a nurturing that you have to do, and it's like a bit of a call and response process. That you have to sort of move and bend, things in gentle ways at some points and at hard ways at other points as well. But you do have to sort of, you have to shape it and sculpt it. I mean, I always think, in a way, it's a bit like creating an artwork in its own right sometimes as well. That it is this kind of shaping, crafting process that you have to go through, rather than necessarily just clearing the decks and starting again, because you have to, you have to take people with you, and you also have to remind people that it was always there. And I think these intentions and ideas that were always embedded in the institution. If you look at like the founding documents of Zukünften, these ideas were always there. It wasn't actually defined as a media art institution. It was designed as an intermedia institution where you worked with and between different media and sensibilities. But it these things always become, in the same way that, the old 18th century institute becomes the art gallery, is the same, in a much shorter space of time that, the Zukünften becomes a global center for media art. And of course, that has all kinds of, complexities and kind of misunderstandings as well. So you basically you have to work your way through it, and remind people that there are certain moments where they've done this all along, and I think that sometimes helps.
Hi, my name is Kamala Netra. I used to work in engineering, and I have a question about the sixth wave of technology advancement that you show in one of your graphics. So you mentioned there Internet of Things, and to my knowledge, Siemens, the company, it's doing quite a lot of development in Karlsruhe with Internet of Things. And is this something that, it just comes to my mind, the idea of like how the big technology companies in the area of Karlsruhe and Germany are somehow, if they have at all any relationship with the Zukünften Institute or with these AI projects. That's my question, if you have any knowledge about it.
About how we're working with the tech companies around us?
Yes.
Yeah. It's funny. It's traditionally they don't necessarily engage in program as such, in artistic program. These companies, they tend to, they're not very well connected in the region. There's a lot of competition in the field, and they tend to be interested in creating their own palaces, so to speak. Nonetheless, we talk to them, and it's my ambition that we do, in a way, find a way to work with them, because I think it's not enough that you're kind of outside the system critiquing. My view was you always have to get your hands dirty and engage and embrace complexity in this way. So we're working on it, but at the moment, they sort of like to play, and they come. A lot of the engineers and people who work for these companies, or the CEOs, they come to Zukünften, but they don't always necessarily see what it is that creativity could do for them. That's kind of the interesting thing at the moment.
Yeah.
And so I kind of look back at some of these kind of things like the artist placement group.
Like my question, goes
for
to
ways which we might imagine that you could kind of engage in the industry in ways which starts to change the culture of the tech industry.
Yeah, like the last image on your talk, it was like an open gathering of people doing sort of like brainstorm around the topic of AI or IoT, Internet of Things. So how do you see this being different from how Siemens is also trying to pursue this goal towards advancement with the Internet of Things and AI?
Yeah, well, the big question obviously is who benefits, and this is one of the big questions of our times. Is as for example, AI, and it'll be robotics next, and it'll be biocomputing next. Who in the end benefits from where is the value created, and where is it redistributed? And at the moment, the whole system is based around value extraction or value accumulation in amongst, to simplify it, let's call it the rich people.
And
and as people are put out of jobs by, as Jeffrey Hinton calls it, job replacement software, i.e. AI. Where do we balance the system in terms of creating a society worth living in? And these are the questions I think that obviously they are discussed, but in the commercial world of tech development are not ones that are at the forefront of people's minds. The forefront is in terms of product development, whereas actually I think the role of people like us would be to introduce the idea of social development in the context of technological development.
So in terms of your conversations, the ones that you had or you plan to have with Siemens in Karlsruhe, what communities have you mapped in your, as your, like in your stakeholders of, at the social level that you think are valuable adding input to like the community benefits of developing your own AI, like you talk about, like having a new EU model. So this is like, I don't know, I'm just not very clear.
It's like a multi-layered approach. So on the one hand, we're working with, it's like Chaos Computer Club. There's a collective called Top Lap. There's, kind of quite, kind of lo-fi, but very influential groups who are working with tech in the city. And then it goes all the way up to kind of mid-sized SMEs, all the way up to Siemens. I mean, IPI, who we do have a conversation with, which is Schwarz Industry, where they're building this huge AI campus in Heilbronn. We're in conversation with them, but obviously that's like crazy scale, crazy, So there's there's a whole layering system. But then what's interesting is, I think that there is an advantage is that the people who come to the big hackathons also work for Siemens.
Yeah.
So whilst you have like the people who come to Goulash Programming Act a lot of them work for all the big companies, but they come to this thing to have fun and go crazy and do things they wouldn't be doing, and then that kind of is part of the feedback system, the feedback loop that you kind of looking to create in the ecology. We did a big workshop on AI and the subconscious. And it was very interesting. We had like families come along and autonomous vehicle engineers from Audi and Volkswagen, and they all came on the same level. And so I think it's like moments like that are quite rich.
Thank you for the information.
Stephen, question? Stephen, and do you want to refer to that?
Yeah, it should be. Okay. I had a question about, are you really interested in placing artists in those companies, like reactivating the artist placement group ideas, and also with this type of engagement for long-term engagement, not 3 weeks or 1 month, but really long-term? Are you really interested in that, and do you really think there's a potential here?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'd like to try it again. I think that's something, we'd certainly be discussing. It's not easy to do because companies aren't always, in the same way that with the artist placement group, there was not always interest, and some worked really well and some were total disasters. So you have to accept that.
But the disaster was also very interesting.
Yeah. But I think it's worth revisiting. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing you were saying, I think it's a very huge potential if you are really having engineers or people employed by Siemens and so on who are coming as a person to your event. This is a very, very huge thing also, and it has a huge disruptive potential. So, yeah. Yeah,
and I think the history also shows that it's not just about artists in industry, but also engineers and other technologists thinking themselves as artists and working in different ways in that sense as well. Like you might have a technologist in residence at the museum. I'm afraid I have to go to another appointment, I'm afraid, in a minute.
We had one more question from Stephen, but we should finish now. Or...
Hi, Alistair. If you have to go, I don't need to ask this question, but I was very excited and inspired by the scale of your proposition. And I know that over the 20 years that I've known you, you've always worked on practices that are on the one-to-one scale. From Grisdale, you've championed them, you've supported them. But remaining in your position, your fellowship position in ZKM, while you're remaining on the one-to-one scale, you're actually ramping up the scale very, very significantly. And I think that to such an extent that we might be blinded to the originality of this proposition. Because I think in the art world, there is a kind of anxiety of scale, that there is a proper scale upon which artists should intervene. And generally speaking, in modernity, it has been on the reduced scale, even when the propositions themselves are monumental. But in this case, and this is my real question, because you're speaking to a group of people who are also directing, for many of them, one-to-one scale art associations, but of a modest scale in a certain respect, working on the social metabolization of art at a more local level. But you're talking about something that is actually grappling with problems on a planetary scale. And that, I wonder why there are so few people who presumably are like-minded, and in terms of recognizing, identifying the problems, and even coming forward with solutions, who are not making use of the world extension which is provided by museums and other art institutions to implement these dangerous programs. Dangerous for the dominant semiotic order, I mean. And I guess the question was this, is I don't think that you're going to say we should all try and like take over the museums and become fellowship directors at the highest level. But there is perhaps a kind of a stronger federation between our more modest one-to-one scale projects that could be imagined within civil society. But I wonder if you could comment on that idea of the anxiety of scale.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the answer is networking. You know, if you kind of build a consensus and network it, that is the process where you can start to address these things. You know, if you go back to, I mean, weirdly, if you go back to John Ruskin, there was a bunch of crazies involving him and others that instigated the Green Movement in the 19th century. And that maybe seemed like a bit of a crazy idea to try and change the course of the Industrial Revolution and the way we, organize the planet. It's taken a long time, but those ambitions are still there. And you kind of look at the global economy of environmental change and action now. You can build this, consensus, and I think you can make headway. And my view always was you have to try.
That's a good conclusion. We have to try. Thank you so much for staying longer with us than planned. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.